Representative Velzate has sponsored House Bill 8036. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. This is my first time here, so thank you. I'm here to introduce House Bill 8036. What it does is it'll require DEM to create environmental justice areas, and would have to be met by, this would be something that, and if an applicant would want to submit, if someone submits an application to want to build in a specific area, DEM would have to obviously look at the application and make sure that it is safe to build there or construct there, whatever it is that they want to do, and also make sure that it has community input as to what these environmental justice areas are. Make sure that there is a big community component to this. So. We don't want to grant an application to someone who is going to possibly build something that could be harmful to that particular community, and the community is not aware of it. I'll be happy to take any questions, and I'll do my best.
Any questions for Representative Velzate? Seeing none, we're going to go through the witness list on this bill.
Thank you.
There are only 6, and a few of them are operating under time constraints. So the first witness we have signed up on 8036 is Danielle Waterfield, and then next would be Hank Webster. So first we'll start with Danielle. Welcome.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Danielle Waterfield, and I'm Chief Policy Officer for ISRI, the voice of the recycling industry. We are a national trade association with more than 1,300 member companies, 18 regional chapters, including our New England chapter that represents recyclers right here in the state of Rhode Island. And we process, broker, and manufacture essential recyclable commodities into raw materials for the nation's critical manufacturing and infrastructure needs. Recyclers have long been socially and economically invested within their communities. We strive to work with our neighbors on how environmental justice efforts can collectively bring about positive change within our communities. Unfortunately, ISRI believes that H8036, will harm and not help these efforts. For the sake of time, today, if okay with the committee, I will explain the recycling industry's top 3 pertinent concerns, and I'll refer you to a written statement that we've submitted for the record that has a little bit more detail. The bill specifically and the concerns I'll address today are, 1, that the bill condemns recycling for no equitable reason. It, 2, lacks objective measures for facility permitting, expansion, and siting. And 3, it harms Rhode Island's recycling and even its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So recycling, I believe we all agree, is a positive activity. I've never heard anyone say recycling is bad. And our citizens want recycling in their communities. It provides efficient reallocation and reuse of valuable resources. Citizens and the recycling industry have collaborated together for centuries on efforts and projects that benefit their local communities. One need only look at the local Boys and Girl Scout aluminum can drives as an example of community benefit and collaboration. The recycling industry's roots are multi-generational family businesses, and we provide alternatives to landfilling, and we actually provide alternatives to irresponsible behaviors such as the abandonment of property that often provides community blight, such as abandonment of vehicles and white goods in public lands. The bill here condemns recycling by targeting our industry as part of a short list for no stated reason. We are listed in the bill as being an environmental problem. There's no guarantees in the legislation that its provisions will be fairly implemented among all industries. Environmental justice should be fairly and equitably addressing the siting and expansion of facilities with serious risks of environmental impacts. It should not harm existing businesses, especially those businesses that are dedicated to source of environmental and economic benefits, such as recycling. The mere existence of a facility in a community does not make it a per se environmental problem or source of environmental pollution. And unfortunately, this bill targets recyclers for no equitable reason. Secondly, the bill lacks any objective measures for which DEM will make its facility permitting, expansion, or siting decisions. The bill will discourage business and Rhode Island investment because it lacks reasonable guideposts for permitting decisions. The bill allows operating permits to be denied based on an undefined cumulative impact in a specified area. There's no clarity in the bill on applicability to existing or new permits, and there's no consideration given to the environmental controls or practices used by recycling facilities already, such as numerous technological things to control dust, for example. It's for the elected legislature to provide guideposts for which the regulators should implement rules impacting industry. This bill gives DEM carte blanche authority to single out and ride roughshod over our recycling operations arbitrarily. The bill also, as our final point, will harm Rhode Island's recycling and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. The bill risks taking the state backwards, and it will hurt responsible recycling operations. DEM just announced on April 1st that Rhode Island greenhouse gas emissions grew by more than 8% between 2017 and 2018. I'm proud to say that the material recycled annually in the United States saves the CO2 equivalent of 410 million tons of greenhouse gas. That's enough energy used to power 43 million homes. And that's in 1 year. That's what recycling saves. Yet, recycling activities that Rhode Island needs to increase its recycling goals are going to be harmed because responsible recycling facilities are going to be harmed simply due to the zip code in which they are located. Investment into the new technologies that is needed to expand and grow facilities that will allow Rhode Island to recycle more and landfill less could be harmed by this, simply because businesses will be loath to invest in new technologies if they don't have clear guideposts on what their permitting requirements will be, or whether they will be able to expand and go into the new technologies that are emerging for hard-to-recycle plastics, for example. We don't want this to happen. We would like to have established goals. This bill, unfortunately, will stifle that investment due to the unclear permitting requirements. It will halt innovation, investment, and into these new materials that Rhode Island wants to be able to recycle. So, in conclusion, ISRI asks you to oppose this bill. We believe in the broad objectives of environmental justice, but we believe in legislation that implements these goals in a fair and clear and not arbitrary or subjective implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the committee? All right, seeing none. The next witness we have signed up is Hank Webster. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. It's nice to be here. My name is Hank Webster. I'm the Rhode Island Director of Acadia Center. We're an environmental and energy research and advocacy organization, and we stand in strong support of H8036, and thank Representative Alzati for introducing it. There you go. Neck doesn't turn so good that way. This bill is pretty straightforward. It uses existing data to identify and establish environmental justice focus areas in an effort to reduce or mitigate the practice of repeatedly citing environmentally harmful activities in the same communities over and over and over again. It looks at the cumulative impacts of those activities and emphasizes the importance of community voices in the permitting decision-making process. The legislation places a responsibility on the permit applicant to provide information about the impacts of their proposed activity and the context against which it will be conducting in that broader cumulative impact statement. So it's going to look at everything that's already going on in an area rather than just saying, you know, yes, my activity is harmful, but it's just my activity. It looks at the history of what's been done in a particular area and tries to set it straight for the community. And it requires that the applicant and the permitting body that the applicant provide the permitting body to identify impacts that can be avoided, or put another way, it will require a consideration of mitigating the impacts wherever possible. And that is another step forward in this process that will help communities. And most critically, it provides communities with hopefully a stronger voice in these decision-making processes. We all know that communities oftentimes are saddled with activities in their area that are harmful, but they don't necessarily have as much of a say because of existing permitting processes. This will hopefully right that wrong. And in conclusion, this legislation does not ban things like recycling, like the previous witness claimed, but it does appropriately weigh the environmental impacts of those activities proposed by new applicants. So, in closing, please pass this legislation, as the Senate already has, and provide impacted communities with a stronger voice and a set of protections from here on out.
Thank
I'd
you
be happy
very
to
much.
answer any questions.
Representative Tanzi, then Representative Agello.
Thank you, Chairman. Is DEM not already making a move in this direction, creating economic justice zones? I'm sorry, the words blanked, but
Focus
yeah,
areas.
environmental, yeah.
So I won't dare to speak for DEM, but I can say that the entire, environmental
It's been publicly discussed.
community is looking at this and trying to do better because the history is pretty clear, and this is one way. It is not the only thing that needs to be done. It is not the only solution, but it is certainly a step in the right direction, and could be strengthened, could be amended if there's particularly problematic provisions. That's all part of the enduring legislative process, but it is certainly important to continue on in this direction.
Absolutely, thank you.
Representative Agello.
Thank you. I'm glad that you clarified that that these are kind of guidelines, because I had noted electric generating as one of the classifications of things that might be not desirable in such an area. And I've had some conversation with a woman who is looking at using brownfield area in one of the, I think, environmental justice areas of the city of Providence, using that brownfield area for solar panels and generating electricity that actually might be used in that very neighborhood. And that's not something that would be not okay.
Well, I think so. Again, I'm guessing into the future on how this will be applied, but because it was in an area that might be one of the environmental focus areas, I think it would still fall under the requirements, but that project would then be able to say there is not, it would have to detail the environmental impacts to that community. And so when you look at something like a solar array on a brownfield site versus redeveloping that for, say, fossil fuel generation, electric generation source, then they would have a very different analysis of what those impacts to the community would be. There wouldn't be the toxics, there wouldn't be the soot, the particulate matter emitted into the community. That's not to say that you might not find something else that is problematic, but at least on that very simple analysis of air quality, which is certainly one of our major concerns in Rhode Island, you would probably see a pretty clear difference between a solar array or a battery storage array. That's another good option for brownfield sites versus a fossil fuel generation site or, say, a large diesel generator. So there was a presentation in this room at 1:30, actually, that went through some of the different solar programs, and the state does a good job of sponsoring brownfield remediation sites for solar installations. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments? Representative Tanzi.
Has DEM, are they signed up to testify at all?
No, they are not.
Okay, thank you.
There is
Representative McGaugh?
There is a letter from DEM. There is written testimony submitted by DEM.
Any further questions or comments for Mr. Webster?
Thank you.
Seeing none, move on to our next witness, David Velis. And after David, Topher Hamblett and Priscilla De La Cruz.
Thank
Good
you, Chair,
afternoon. Welcome.
and members of the committee. I'm testifying for a couple of bills. Would you want me to specifically just speak on this one and wait, or do them all?
No, if you want to handle them all while you're up there, that's great.
I guess I'll start with this one. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Velis. I am the director of the Rhode Island Interfaith Coalition to Reduce Poverty, a coalition of faith leaders and advocates from different faiths throughout Rhode Island that are united in the belief to address inequality and poverty. I'm also the Environmental Justice Chair and Vice Chair of the Sierra Club in Rhode Island, so I'll be testifying on both those hats. For Bill 8036, I'm here to voice my support. Thank you to Rep. Alzate and everyone who signed on. I'm glad this bill is in this committee because it allows me and us to kind of really think about something that environmental justice organizers like myself have always known, that environmental justice is social justice. That racism, inequality, housing insecurity, food insecurity are intricately linked to environmental injustice. Communities of color and poor communities historically in the country, in our world, in Rhode Island, have been disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards such as lead poisoning rates, asthma rates, air quality, water quality. We must start taking this really serious and finally create a process where we have an evaluation process before we continue to burden communities of color and poor communities with developments and further harm to their communities. I will also add that my hope for this bill and other bills that come like it, for implementation, I do want for everyone to be on board with it to be done in collaboration and partnership with environmental justice groups and communities, because a lot of the times, one of the missing puzzles that continues to come up is that there is no community input in creation and implementation of policy, and we want to change that in the spirit of inclusion and thinking about those communities. We want to make sure that whatever the implementation process is for community input for any kind of development or this legislation like this, that those impacted are at the table. So thank you for that bill. Next, I want to talk about Bill 7739. Thank you to Rep. Geraldo for introducing it, banning private prisons. I just want to say that we are morally against, as a coalition of faith leaders, against the profiting from incarcerations. It is fundamentally against the idea of justice for us and the system of justice, because it incentivizes the incarceration of people, therefore increases the possibility of perpetuating the problem with an unjust legal system. So we really like this bill. We've supported it for many years. We think that private prisons have no place in Rhode Island. I know some other people will come up and speak a little bit more about that bill, but we just wanted, as an interfaith coalition, to voice our concerns. Our support for that bill and against private prisons. And lastly, Speaking on Bills 7736 and 7737, I like that they're together. Thank you to Rep. Geraldo and Rep. Cesar for those bills. For us, it comes down to, if we don't know, we're not going to fix it. If we don't know, we will continue to perpetuate inequality in Rhode Island. So the thought of legislators getting an impact statement for every legislation, the thought of legislators having to go through a training about inclusion and inequality is something that should be happening already. We do this in our own organizations. We think about how does our actions, how do our legislations impact people who are already vulnerable and already being impacted. For us, for me specifically, but for us, it's also about being trauma-informed, a term that I believe a lot of us are aware of, but it really takes into account, how does my actions affect somebody who's already being impacted? And that's what poverty, inequality, sexism, racism, all of those things is trauma. Trauma in our communities that evolve into generational trauma of communities being disproportionately impacted by oppression. So we must do better. We have to do better. We support these bills because it allows us to have the information we need before moving forward on legislation and making ourselves more equitable and inclusive. So thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Velis from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you again.
Also, it's really warm in here.
It is so hot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for opening the windows.
Are you? Want to switch seats? Because I'm dying.
Next
Like, one seat
witness
over.
we have signed up is Topher Hamblett. Okay. Then Kai Salem. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Shanley. Thanks to the committee. And thank you, Rep. Alzate, for introducing this bill. My name is Kai Salem. I am testifying on behalf of the Environment Council of Rhode Island, where I am the Vice President of Policy. We support H8036 because it starts the massive challenge of rectifying some of the wrongs of environmental injustice. Environmental justice, or environmental injustice really, is the notion that over time, the communities that disproportionately bear many societal injustices also bear the burden of environmental injustice. So these are communities in Rhode Island that are continuously slammed with environmental impacts. I wish I had the maps to show you today how the same communities that have the highest rate of lead poisoning are the ones that have the highest rate of asthma. These are the same communities that have the highest rate of oil spills and the highest rate of toxic leaks from polluting industries. We have seen again and again over the history of the United States that companies care more about their profits than they do about protecting public health. And that's why we had environmental laws in the first place. Environmental laws weren't really a thing until the 60s and 70s. Think Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, when people realized that pesticides, which were created for farming profits, were also killing off all of our birds. We are so lucky that we have a government that can protect the people from injustice. And yet, despite the many, many improvements we've made over time when it comes to our environmental laws, some communities still don't have a voice in protecting themselves from environmental injustice, and that is why these communities bear these disproportionate impacts. These are the communities that are otherwise marginalized because of race or income or immigration status, and we have these communities here in Rhode Island. When we think about environmental justice or environmental justice, you might think of communities in Mississippi or Louisiana or West Virginia, where the DuPont plants were that leaked PFAS into people's water and gave a lot of people cancer. But we have that injustice here in Rhode Island as well, in many communities. What we don't have is any resources or any people who are really focused, especially at the state government level, on figuring out this issue and solving it. We don't have a single law on the books when it comes to environmental justice. We don't even have a state definition for what environmental justice is. Without these basic resources to outline environmental justice and start to address it, we can't solve this problem. This bill, H8036, as well as two others that I will name, will give Rhode Island a foothold in addressing environmental injustice. So this bill, what it does is it defines environmental justice and defines environmental justice communities. That's really important. Definitions seem silly, whatever, they don't actually do anything, but there are a lot of other bills, including Act on Climate last year, that reference environmental justice, and we need a definition so that we can start funneling our resources into environmental justice communities, so we can start tracking the impacts, and so our state agencies can get to work in protecting these communities that have borne this disproportionate harm. It also avoids disruption to the permitting process by bringing communities into the permitting discussion earlier. So several times over the past couple of years, we have seen environmental justice communities say, we don't want this polluting facility here. At the very last minute, right before all of the permits are about to be through, right before the company is starting to site a new polluting facility, the community realizes that this is happening. They haven't been involved in the process at all, and says, we don't want this site here. Waiting until the last minute to let communities find out about these projects on their own is extremely disruptive to the siting process. This bill will avoid that disruption by bringing communities in from the beginning. Third, as my colleagues who testified before me already identified, this does not harm existing facilities. This is really only about protecting communities from new polluting facilities. The list of facilities is short, and not all of the facilities that are on the list will actually be polluting facilities. If a recycling facility or a solar facility or any other type of facility is not going to pollute a community, no problem, it'll be permitted. Similarly, if a community is found to not have cumulative impacts sufficient to warrant not citing that facility there, the project will be permitted, no problem. So this is about a new permitting process to help us get a foothold, but again, defining environmental justice zone is one of the most important features of this policy. Similar legislation just passed in Massachusetts last year. We've also seen similar legislation in New Jersey. That's partly what this bill was modeled after. I want to mention that we do need industrial facilities. We do need everything from recycling facilities to electric generation. The goal is not to not allow those facilities in the state. Instead, the goal is to help channel those facilities to where in the state they're best, they most likely should go. Because environmental justice communities have borne too much of this burden for too long, only because they don't have the resources to fight it. And that is what's inequitable. The last thing I'd like to mention is, again, that I wish we had more resources for doing environmental justice work in the state. There is currently another piece of legislation that I wish had gone through this committee but was in environment to get an environmental justice advisory board that will help us work on this type of issue in the future. We also really need an environmental justice director, organizer, administrator, some position at DEM to start doing this work. So I hope that we can work on that through finance this year. I think that is all of the things I wanted to say, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Salem? Seeing none, thank you again.
Environmental justice zones. There's so many bills tonight, it's really hard to keep up. But the environmental justice zones, so much of my work has brought me into areas where people have been assaulted by big companies that just want to build whatever. Barberville had this Inventorgy plant, the Port of Providence. And I heard that person, the woman, talking about recyclers. And I just want to point out that there was a submarine fire in the Port of Providence not too long ago. A submarine caught fire. It's a Russian submarine. The rubber insert caught fire because they were welding it apart or cutting it apart somehow. And suddenly we had this big, huge black plume of smoke going into the sky, East Providence, South Providence. We're talking about possibly carcinogenic stuff from 1950s Soviet-era submarine. I mean, what is even in that? Does anybody even know what the Soviets were using at the time? And it wasn't meant to catch fire, right? And I also thought the statement about comparing the recyclers in the port to Girl Scouts collecting aluminum cans was ridiculous. And I think that's the last bill I want to talk about.